Welcome to the Better Never Ends podcast. We've made it our mission to share with you the expertise and wisdom of role models and leading experts in their field, teaching us about how we can be better, telling stories about their journey to better, inspiring you to discover yours. Today's going to be a good one. We've got a clinical psychologist in with us today, Dr. Steve Mayers. And the regular listeners will know I love talk about psychology, so you should hear me geeking out a little bit and being super interested in what's going to be said today. I will no longer call him Dr. Steve Mayers because he is Steve. Steve, who pretty good on his bike, likes to talk about the mind, likes to talk with people, and he's got a really interesting story to tell us today. Let's go straight in with some meaty stuff that I think is quite topical for the today world. We have access to so much fantastic information. We have social media now, and that's a fantastic thing, a great resource. It's been a huge learning experience for me over the years of having access to it, and I hope we've contributed back to that world as well. However, what it can do is it gives people a lot of information that they're not necessarily fully technically able to understand and comprehend and therefore diagnose. And that's the crux of what we're going to go in with today, is that many people are self-diagnosing and using things they learn on social media as if they are expert in that subject. So Steve, tell us your take on the therapy culture that social media is propagating.
Yeah, thanks, Charlie. I think, I was born in 85, and I think in the 90s and early noughties when I was growing up, there was not much awareness or information about mental health. And I think actually a lot of when I first started to understand myself was when I started to study psychology. But I think over the last 20 years, maybe since Facebook and that time onwards, we now have so much access to information that I think there's whole generations of young people who are understanding their experience purely through the lens of ideas related to therapy or medicalized perspectives on mental health. And although those ideas are sometimes useful, they also can, I guess, bring their own limitations and connotations. For example, lots of people use terms like narcissist nowadays as if that's, a very common thing. ADHD is a thing that's often spoken about, and it seems as I heard a comedian not too long ago say the thing about ADHD is once you get a diagnosis, you're really good at diagnosing other people, and then, it kind of propagates itself. And I'm not here to say that those things aren't aspects of human experience or aren't important to talk about. But I think that sometimes there's too much information about it that's unhelpful. And I think the reason for that, and one of the reasons also why I've been kind of hesitant to be on social media since I finished my training, really, even though I've thought about starting YouTube channels and things like that, is because of the way the algorithm works. You have to simplify the message in order to for it to become popular and kind of be seen, really. So I think a lot of the time you have things that are inevitably complex and questions that would probably benefit from the answer of "it depends" being given very simple answers, which means that there's these kind of like oversimplified, kind of exaggerated narratives that form. And I think that's really problematic.
Yeah, the algorithm concept is something that we've almost decided to just accept our fate with. Our content doesn't tend to be binary. We tend to have these it depends answers, and there's a bit of this, there's a bit of that, and this grey area concept, which algorithms don't tend to favour very well. We've accepted our fate because we think that the message is important, and we're happy with the long form content being this conversation around things, and people make their own minds up. So as a result, our Instagram is minimally effective, and it works well for our audience, but it's not going to explode because we don't do that. And it's great to hear you kind of agreeing with that in your own way too. With these terms, things like narcissist, let's use narcissist then as an example. Tell us firstly, what is a narcissist?
I mean, I guess that's a question that I would kind of respond with like, it depends. I mean, rather than, I think the temptation is to find some sort of definition, right? As to like, this is what you should spot. And then I would be falling into that same pattern. I guess I would add before I answer that as well, that I did once hear somebody say, often the people who are busy doing the clinical work are not the people who have the time to propagate the messages on social media or aren't comfortable in doing so. So that also feeds into this kind of problem. I think for me, a lot of the time in society, people use the word narcissist when somebody has done something that seems selfish or hurtful to them. I mean, the origin of the word is in Greek mythology, in the story of Narcissus who fell in love with his own reflection and drowned. So it's kind of, that story was a warning for people to not be too about yourself. For me, I think regardless of how somebody presents in society, whether that's in terms of their mental health, the way that their personality is, it's all understandable in the context of their early experiences. I don't think it forms through biology, and I don't think it forms without a sense of without making sense of early experiences in particular ways. So I would see narcissism as a defense against some sort of insecurity. I guess the question around, or maybe one of the challenges that people face when they describe somebody or they experience someone who they would describe as a narcissist, is that perhaps they could see that, well, early on they had some challenging time, but the person refuses to accept that the context shaped their current experience. And that is a very powerful defense, the kind of like, I don't have a problem, you have a problem. And I think the grappling with that is really tough. And so I could see the temptation to fall back and just be like, classic narcissist. I was raised by a narcissist, these people are narcissists, because it gives us permission to disconnect or to other. But I actually don't think that's for the betterment of anybody, really. It increases intolerance.
If someone that you recognize has a level of narcissistic tendency within their own personality, how might you as a therapist then start to work with them? And would someone come to, this is an interesting thing, would someone come to you and say, I'm a narcissist?
Sometimes people have come to meet with me and said that other people have said that they're a narcissist. But usually, sometimes I've worked with people where it feels like the narrative in our work is largely centered on their experiences, or it seems like there's some kind of filter, which means that they are kind of infallible and other people are more to blame. So there are elements of that which can be useful to kind of help somebody to identify. But there aren't many people who come and say, I am a narcissist. In some ways that I guess would be seen as narcissistic in itself, right? Because it's like, what? Yeah. But yeah, it's a complex thing to come up against. But in my mind, the manifestation of distress, as I mentioned, is always understandable in the context. And I think the challenge is to work with the person or the people around the person as well, if possible, to make sense of what it is and to move them to a different way of being in their lives, if that's what they want. Some people don't want that. And I guess that, I suppose that's the challenge for people in society when they come up against people who they might describe as a narcissist. Usually they're more interested in themselves, their experiences, they're less likely to take responsibility, and they don't really want to do anything about it.
Because I suppose it's more common for someone to come in and say, my friend or my family member or my partner is a narcissist. And then at that point, you're helping them navigate that situation.
Yeah, to understand kind of like how they work relationally. But it's a real challenge. One of the big limitations of therapy is that in our kind of current Western conceptualization of what it is to help people, we kind of chop them off from their social system, we isolate them, and we speak to them individually. And there are naturally limitations in that process because we only get one person's perspective. Some of the ideas I've been interested in have been more from systemic and family therapy. And when I meet with someone individually, I still try and think of them in that way and ask questions as if other people are in the room. Like, what would X person say if they were here? Or what do you think it's like for this person, to kind of cultivate that broader awareness. And it's quite surprising sometimes how often people say, I actually don't know what they would say about that, or I don't know what that's like for them. So that process can be helpful in itself. But I think that Yeah, increasingly to manage these problems, we need to meet with more than one person or think about other ways to do this. But I mean, this has its, maybe we'll talk more about this, maybe not, but all of this has its roots in kind of neoliberalism and the Thatcher Reagan government based ideas about what society should be like in the West. And, you know, a lot of that was based on, the dismantling of the community and the unions and all that sort of stuff, and it's all about the individual, and everyone gets a fair opportunity and you've got to make the most of it. Most of us intuitively know that that's not the case, but yeah, our therapy approach and the way that we individualize people in some ways is a reflection on that, which isn't to say that I never think it's useful. I guess this is one of those it depends things, because my job is to meet with people individually almost exclusively, and yet I also think that it's a limitation.
Surely you can have both. You can have those deep interactive conversations with a person to help them self-discover. But I guess what you're saying is that the end result has to involve more than just that conversation. There has to be an application into society. There has to be an integration of these ideas into society as well, whether it's the workplace, whether it's community settings, whatever. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. I guess one of the good questions to ponder is, what is a good outcome in therapy? Like, is it if a person leaves therapy feeling empowered and as though they have a greater sense of themselves? I guess some would argue that in itself will have ramifications for the broader system in which they exist. And sometimes that can be one of the limitations of coming out of therapy, or, the time in between, is that people are in an oppressive system. But I think that we should be seeing the outcomes of therapy as good if they also benefit the system around them. I know through my own experience of therapy that there were times where I felt more or less connected to my parents, more kind of annoyed about things that had happened. And actually that didn't feel like it was to the betterment of anything in my experience. And, there was something about kind of nuance in that. I was speaking with somebody earlier today who said, if everybody looks to better themselves, then how does that function in society? Like, maybe what we should be doing is trying to find peace, contentment, calmness. Yeah.
This is a contradiction with our very podcast right here, the Better Health Podcast. If everyone is trying to be better, then where does that leave less than better? Where what does that mean? Right.
Yeah.
So I will ask you at the end of this podcast, what does better never ends mean to you? And now I'm very much looking forward to your answer, because I think there will be some it depends and it's this, it's that. So okay, well, we'll come back to that. Very much so. I love a paradox. Okay, well, if you mentioned earlier that one of the reasons why, or one of the successes of therapy, was that someone will get a better sense of themselves. What does that really mean? What does that mean to you?
Yeah. I think that in some ways our task in life is to become more like ourselves as we move through our life. And the ideas that I like in relation to that, I think Carl Jung had a really optimistic perspective on what it is to age. Usually we're kind of fed this idea that we, peak in somewhere in our late 20s, early 30s, and it's all downhill. Things get achy, things get hard. But his perspective was that we continue to accumulate wisdom, knowledge, and become a better person, I guess. Those probably weren't his words, but we develop throughout our lives, and in doing so, he described this process of circumambulation, which is kind of a movement pattern where we circle around something that gets closer to the center. It's used in a religious context traditionally, but it describes, I think, as I understand it, a way of moving towards being more like ourselves throughout our lives. And as we get closer, the questions that we might ask ourselves are like, what is it that gives me energy? What do I feel drawn to? What do I find challenging? Do I feel like I'm on the right path, or am I being dragged down the path? And can I change my experience of any of these things along the way? I guess some of the challenges in that or that the things that attract us or repel us might be a reflection of some challenge that we've had early on in our life or some difficulty in relationships. So we have to look at the darker parts of our experience in order to be able to do that well. Otherwise, we might end up in relationships that feel right but actually don't serve us in the long term.
For this visual metaphor in my mind of someone circling a mountain and this upward spiral concept of them gradually reaching the pinnacle of this mountain, the pinnacle of their lives towards the end. It's actually a really lovely concept of someone working towards that. And anyone who's climbed a mountain knows that it's hard and it's difficult and you need to train for it. And there's things that get in your way and you can get lost. And actually that fits in your experience and your description of how you interpret that. And what are the kind of things that you might do to apply that in your therapy work?
I think a lot of the times when I meet with people, they talk about things in relation to feeling anxious, their mood being low, or there's other types of ways that distress can manifest. But in my mind, it's like the manifestation is somewhat irrelevant. It's like kind of what's at the core of that. Oftentimes, I sit opposite people, and I have this like edge within me to support them to be, I don't know, to be more like themselves in the world, to be able to be in the world differently, to put themselves forward, because usually the experiences that causes challenge in early life lead to a kind of diminishment of self. I think inevitably childhood generally does that. When I think of my niece and nephew, when they were born, they were such raw energy, and like everything they had was like a big experience, and everyone was their friend. And as they've grown in close to 10, they've just gradually become aware of like social nuance and people being critical and kind of rules and anxieties and things that form. And I think in some ways early on in life, early on in life we have this kind of like raw energy that we in some ways have to reconnect with later. A lot of the work that I do with people is around the inner child and kind of thinking about that younger version of themselves. Because often what happens is that we experience our world from our family system outwards, but when we look back, it looks like we just knew the world, but of course we didn't. So the small experiences that we had where we were ridiculed or diminished or not listened to, or our feelings were invalidated or wherever it might be, the response to those becomes normalized. And often when I meet with people and we start to think about their younger self, it becomes really challenging to feel compassion to that version of them, because they've internalized what the adults did around them, which is to be like, oh, that's fine, just get on with it, pull yourself up, why are you crying, don't be angry, whatever it might be. And so undoing that to some extent, whether it can be undone or not, I'm not too sure, but kind of exploring that and then connecting people more to the kind of essence of self, I think is one of the most valuable parts of the process of therapy.
When you say internalized, you were saying internalized in the context of experiencing and learning from those around you, do you really mean like biologically internalized?
I guess, I mean, I don't think anything psychologically happens without our biology being involved. To my sense of it is that the way that I understand emotional experience is a little bit like the movie Inside Out. They did a pretty good job there of representing. Yeah. And so they consulted emotion researchers for that. And so the core emotional states that are represented in the movies are pretty much right. And so the idea is that we all have those experiences all the time. Our emotions are just always happening, but a lot of the time they're happening at a subconscious level, and the experience of self will be that we might feel anxious. So like, I don't know about you, but I've definitely come out of situations where I've been like, oh, I just feel like something isn't right. And then I'm like, oh, I'm actually really pissed off or annoyed at what this person said, or I actually feel quite sad, or even, I'm happy, but I'm not sure I can be happy about this thing, wherever it might be. And so when we're younger, what we ideally need is an adult or caregiver around us who helps us to understand and explore our emotional selves. So I don't know, one example might be you've got two young children, let's say they're like 3 or 4, so they're just developing language.
I have one of those.
Okay, so let's say you've got 2, and then they're playing with each other, little Johnny, little Jenny, And while Johnny's building a sandcastle, Jenny comes over and she whacks it over. Johnny's really annoyed and he hits her on the head with the spade, right? Mum, who's helping the child to understand the emotions, might come over to Johnny and say, hey, Johnny, it's okay to feel angry, which is what you've been having, and let's explore what that is. And it's okay to want to hit your sister, but we don't hit people because that causes pain. And, you know, in some ways, the reason why people don't go around beating each other up is because we have empathy for how that might feel.
And I guess at that age, kids are all narcissists to some degree. The way they experience the world is very much through their lens, and they won't understand how that makes someone else feel. They only understand their own feelings. So that's what you're describing there, is helping them learn other people's feelings are important too.
Yeah.
You can't just go around expressing how you feel regardless of the consequences.
Yeah. And I think also helping them to understand that it's okay to want to hurt somebody. That's one of the nuances that I think gets a bit lost in our societal narratives about what is and isn't okay. You know, is it okay to have a destructive thought towards another? Because oftentimes in therapy, people will come with some sort of shame around something that they've thought or wanted to do. And that's can be at the root of a lot of compulsive thought around, like, oh, I feel like I want to do this thing, I had the thought of it, therefore it's real. And if we can give people an experience where what they want to do is something that's okay as long as they don't do it, then it kind of changes their relationship to it. And I think probably reduces the likelihood that they would.
It's like the phenomenon of being on the top of a really tall building and wanting to jump off. It doesn't make you suicidal, because you don't act on it. And I've done that. Like, God, imagine if I stood up, I could do that. And I'm not suicidal. And I had that thought. So that's what you're just joining together there, isn't it? The thought is not the same as the action. They're different. They can be the same, but it's up to you. You have a choice.
Yeah, 100%. I think I'll often share with people in therapy the times when I've had the thought of driving my car into a wall on my scooter when I had a Vespa, or that time when I was going to bed and I felt like I heard someone shout my name, which, you know, in some ways is on the continuum of hallucination. But the way that that's responded to is really important in how we make sense of it. And it can really, if somebody says to you, hey, like, it's fine that you have that, I had that too, it all of a sudden diffuses. Whereas if somebody says, what, you did that? And like, that's probably something's wrong with you. It might be just like, make a few notes and let me ask you about some other symptoms. I guess the irony in that method of perceived support is that it can perpetuate and cultivate a problem that didn't need to exist.
I think there's two parts there that just came to my mind, is that firstly, normalizing it can be a really helpful thing, is to say, hey, this happens to me too. But labeling it might not be. You know, there could be a problem with labeling it, and that's what you were saying earlier about the ADHD culture. Hey, I've got ADHD. Maybe you have too. I think you've got it as well. You know, in that situation, how might you work with someone to get them to healthily experience that label or not label?
Yeah. I think fundamentally, as I've kind of alluded to, for me, like, mental health is on a continuum. There is no cutoff where someone has or doesn't have a condition, and there's no difference between us who are providing support and them who are needing support. I think we all exist in this thing called life, I guess, and we're all trying to make sense of these things together. Oftentimes I've met with people who are like, well, I have this label and it's a kind of useful thing to me, and generally over time I've realized that actually I don't want to resist that. I don't want to say to somebody, you don't understand your experience in the way that you should, even though I have some big reservations about what those things can entail or what the connotations of having those labels can be. So I think for me, it's working around the idea that it's important not what's wrong with you, but what's happened to you. And so to go back to that idea of what are the early experiences that have formed this current pattern of experience of being in the world and being in your life and your relationships, and can we, through exploration, understand those a bit more and facilitate some sort of change in relation to that. And I think naturally, when we move to that position of what's happened to you rather than what's wrong with you, it allows for all different sorts of conversations and sense making. Sometimes I think, and maybe this links back to the therapy culture idea at the beginning, the idea of having a thing that explains the challenges that we've had, or why people are annoyed at us, or why people don't like us at certain times, or wherever it might be, can sometimes provide relief. And I think I can understand why that is. In some ways, we look for reasons. We try and make sense all the time, and we look for reasons as to why we might be different. And I guess neurodivergence is one of those ideas that can be quite useful to people, where they're like, or maybe I am neurodivergent in some way. I think as long as we keep these things on a continuum and we make efforts to understand how that's different for each person, to think about the it depends and the nuance in that, then I think we can have both.
It's always interesting for me to understand a person's journey in their earlier life, and you've spoken a lot about that already in the importance of the therapy environment, of helping someone understand their early experiences. Tell us a bit about your early experiences. What was it about young Steve that prompted you to become the pretty decent cyclist and clinical psychologist that you are today?
Yeah. Well, the cyclist is, maybe these stories run in parallel, but I jumped on a bike without stabilizers when I was 2 that a neighbor had thrown out in their front yard, and I always rode a bike. In fact, maybe things aren't so different now that I'm nearly 40 to when I was in my teenage years. I grew up in the northwest near Liverpool. Like, my parents were from there. We lived about as far out of Liverpool as you can get and still be considered a Scouser. And I think there was something about that part of the world at that time, in kind of the early 90s when I was growing up, where there was kind of this anti-establishment idea that was kind of going around about, being different to other parts of the country, maybe because of some of what had happened socio-politically over the preceding years before I was born, which in some ways had me thinking that there were other ways to understand what was going on. And so I grew up in a family system where lots of people were experiencing distress. And so before I knew what psychology was, I knew that I had an auntie who was really struggling and, going to the doctor and was being given medication. But then there was something that just always didn't feel right, that's what was happening. Like, why aren't people talking with the person about this? Intuitively, there were narratives about, oh, this is because of that. And yet you go to see a doctor and then you're given a medication and not some sort of opportunity to explore it. I didn't know that that's what it was, but I guess as I got to A-level and studied psychology, the first bits were models of memory and things like that, and understanding dreams, that I felt like I was given this way to think about human experience. And I saw kind of glimmers of hope of, like, actually I can understand the world differently. And fundamentally my own experience, because I was really anxious when I was younger. I was worried about my health a lot. In my teenage years, I was kind of anxious about being around older kids. I was punched in the face when I was 9 randomly by some kid who walked down the street. There's these things that just fed into me being trepidatious. I sometimes felt like I wasn't really built for that environment. And so I was lucky to have an immediate family system that supported me to go into further education and then to go to university. And I kind of just found my way really through some fairly challenging parts to clinical psychology, partly because I kept feeling as though I was learning to think more and think differently, and that felt like a really powerful thing to be gifted. And then I thought, well, actually I can offer this to other people too, because if this has been so revelatory for me, then maybe it can be for others. And maybe therapy is the thing that people were missing when they were given medication. I think over time I then realized that it's not as simple as that. There's more complexity, but there's something about those things that kind of fed into where I am.
You're now living in London, and I know you've spent some time in Australia. So do you think that some of that feeling when you were younger of, I'm not quite sure I'm built for this kind of area, do you think that fed into your urge to see the wider world and see if you fit in better somewhere else?
Yeah, 100%. When I moved to London in my early 20s, I was very kind of dismissive of home, like, oh, who would want to live there? And that's changed over time. I think through doing my own work, I've kind of accepted more of like where I'm from and what that's like, and actually really embrace it now. I like going home. But yeah, I was trying to find a different way, or a different way of doing things, different group of people to kind of connect with. And yeah, I think I did find that. I think that it turns out that when you live in different places and people will have different life experiences, their expectations and understanding of the world is very different. And same with being in Australia and working with different people in that context too. Yeah, I think we all we all make sense of our experiences differently. You know, I heard there's a guy called Stephen Grolsch, and he wrote a book called The Examined Life, and he spoke about how as a therapist, it's a privilege because he gets paid to learn every day. And I still hold on to that position. I think whenever I meet with somebody, I feel like I'm learning. And that in some ways, I guess now that I'm saying it, was a reflection on what happened when I decided to like leave home and move to somewhere else and try and expand my experience, was that I was able to find new ways to learn about kind of what it is to be a person from different perspectives. And yeah, I still do that. I don't think I ever want to not feel like that. You know, I want to always feel like this is somewhat familiar, but also completely new when I meet with people in therapy, for example.
You mentioned earlier about the internalization of the surroundings, and accent for me is a really interesting form of the internalization of your surroundings, and how the younger we are, the more likely it is that our accent will change. And you've spoken about being from the outskirts of Liverpool, so you would naturally think of certainly the people from the UK will recognise the Scouse accent very strongly. You don't have a very strong accent at all. It's quite a neutral accent, isn't it? So around that time, it's quite normal for someone to adopt the accent of their surroundings, isn't it? And do you think that has some kind of internalisation, psychological origins?
Yeah, I think when I grew up, I had like quite a thick Scouse accent, and I would to fit in with my mates and it was a bit cooler to be from near Liverpool than it was to be from near St. Helens or Warrington, so there was like, I'm at home, all of my family have more of a Scouse accent than I do. But yeah, it's interesting that this comes up because recently my girlfriend, who is Australian and is from Sydney, often gets confused for being English, and I get confused for being Australian because I think I picked up the accent, or I've wondered a bit about that. I've wondered like what that kind of means that I've adopted this kind of way of speaking. When I first moved to London in my early 20s, I was doing some neuropsychological assessments, which required a lot of reading out kind of standardized words. And I noticed that when I said words like truck with a northern uk sound, people didn't actually know what I was saying. They thought it was like a non-word. So initially I remember changing some of what I said for that reason. But yeah, I had a cousin who also moved to London, and we kind of both had a similar thing where our accents shifted a bit. And maybe some of that is trying to fit in, trying to find some place to feel more connected or wherever it might be.
And it seems like that's a very subconscious, natural thing that happens when we move to different locations. But I guess a lot of the work you do is helping people who haven't been able to adapt, who haven't been able to work through things themselves. What are some typical barriers that you find people come to you with that you might help you? I think we can come back to that idea of this constant circumambulation around themselves, trying to find the true meaning of themselves, the true version of themselves. What are some typical barriers that you help people to navigate around?
Yeah, good question. I guess when that comes up naturally, I kind of think about like who have I spoken with recently, and I think in some ways there is something about supporting people to make sense of what their experience is, and maybe that echoes what I mentioned earlier about what psychology offered to me, which was like ways of languaging things. Language is a powerful tool, and I guess at a very early age we start to assume that we know what things mean, and language can take away from nuance and experience. When a child learns that a bird is a bird, they never have to think about what this thing is anymore. It's just that's a bird, and I think we shorthand through language often. In the process of therapy, I see my task in some ways is to slow that down and deconstruct it and really understand it a little bit more. Like, what is it that you mean when you say that you're depressed or angry? Like, how do you make sense of that? What's that like in your body? What's that like in your mind? How do other people experience that? And I think through collaboratively engaging in that process, we can start to find new meaning. And so I had somebody once say, you know, therapy is a process of making something unconscious conscious, or unspoken spoken. And I think slowing things down really helps with that. Doesn't really answer your question about what people come with, but I guess that's the kind of...
Well, I've just picked one up. You said you used the word embodiment and what they're feeling in their body. That has to be something as well, right? So the mind-body connection, the mind-body, the body-mind, I've heard it's referenced in lots of different ways. It's now absolutely clear that those two things are aligned or linked together. For many centuries, we believed that they were separate, and now we're clear that they're the same. So if we can be clear with that, and we can be confident that they are linked, what are some common situations where you can help someone understand the things they feel in their body could be linked to the thoughts they're having and their childhood perhaps as well?
Yeah. I think that most people, there's the exception to this, but it's kind of rare. Most people, when I ask them about a thing that happened and they say it was challenging, you know, what was that like in your body or in your mind, they will inevitably talk about some sort of emotional experience in their body or some sort of manifestation of anxiety in their body. So whether that's some sort of discharge or tension, feeling in the pit of the stomach, tightness in the chest, or whether it's like the sinking that happens when we feel sad, or the energy that comes when we feel angry and we want to get up and clench our fists and, you know, go beat someone up. I mean, that's kind of the raw energy of that. So I think that in some ways the artificial dichotomy has been imposed on people's experience rather than reflecting it. Because most people are quite good at that. One of the challenges is when people are really good at thinking, and lots of people that I meet with they're really smart, intellectually very capable. We can spend, and I say we because this has been a thing for me and I've understood more in my therapy process. I can be more in my mind, and I work with people who can kind of go to their mind. And so that becomes a space of rationalization that's very cognitive and very above the neck. And in doing so, it leads to a kind of ignoring of what happens in the body. So one of the challenges in therapy is to help people to continue to notice like what that's like for them, what's going on in their body, even if they don't have the words for it or they're not quite sure what it is. To notice the experience of anxiety and to regulate that, usually through the breath. It
happens a lot in my physiotherapy sessions with clients, is that, and I tend to see people who are on average a bit more complicated and have seen other physios it hasn't worked out. So most of the standard stuff has kind of been tried and not worked. Probably the biomedical stuff. So a clear structural pathology that maybe just needed rehab and time and was going to get better anyway, and maybe we helped it get better a bit faster. So I'm more likely to see someone who that isn't necessarily the case for. And it's those people who still feel a bit lost and confused, and they come in and say, I can't understand why I feel this. Sometimes I'm like this, I feel it there, and sometimes I'm in a completely other random situation, I'm feeling that. Because they are looking at it through a lens of biology, of why is my muscle doing this when it's treated, it then feels better, but it comes back 3 days later. But if we think about the reality of a structural injury or a structural pathology, it'd be quite unusual for it to stop hurting for a period of days and then to start hurting again. A structural injury doesn't become less injured and more injured and fluctuate like that. It tends to have a very, very predictable movement, posture, or thing that brings it on. So what people struggle with is that it might be a psychological stress of some sort, or a sociological stress of some sort, an environment that they're in and a thought that they're having. And as soon as I can draw them to that possibility, you can see in their eyes, I get it, I understand it. Like you said earlier, can you help an unconscious become conscious? Can you help an unspoken become spoken? And once they get it and they have some language attached to it, they can often come back and I'm now understanding it, I'm sensing these patterns. And you can see that the distress has gone. They might still be suffering and struggling, but they're not distressed so much. So it's a really interesting thing that I think in society we're still struggling with, actually. And we spoke a bit earlier, I can't remember if it was on or off air, about some of the things we do quite naturally being obvious to us, but not necessarily obvious to others. This is one of those, I think, the mind-body link. That these symptoms we could feel in our body, whether it's IBS and gut problems, whether it's chronic pain, feeling it in our knee or in our back, that they could be regulated either up or down by our thoughts and our feelings and our environment and our experience. That's the thing that is still not very well understood, I believe, in our society, even though to me and you, because we deal with it every day, is obvious.
Yeah. I feel like I'm still learning a lot about that through the treatment that I have. I mean, I spend a lot of time on the bike kind of hunched forward and have issues around the front of my hips, and my current physio talks a lot about my ascending colon and how that drives a lot of the tension, and how my diet and my stress impact on that. And although I knew that the gut and mind were related, I'd never understood it in that sort of way and knew what it felt like when that was tense. And so I think there is something about the insight that's offered through that way of conceptualizing experience that's really important. At the moment, my mum's got a dodgy knee and she's really struggling with it. And I think part of why she's struggling is that she doesn't have a clear course for rehabilitation or a clear sense of what caused it. There's lots of questions. And so we're trying to get her to see a physio that I know closer to home. And part of that is to provide some guidance as to like, this is what I think has led to this. This is what's happened that's made that, and why this is here. And this is what we're going to do in order to try and make that better. Sometimes when I meet with people in therapy, I've had a heavy emphasis on being very collaborative in the process. Like, you know you better than I will ever know you. And therefore, like, let's do this together. And I know that people have wanted me to take that position of like, I kind of know what's going on and I think I know how to help you. And I've, over time, been more comfortable leaning into that, because I think that realistically, we all need that from time to time. Somebody who's like, I've got you, or I'm here for this. And I don't know everything, but I'm trying to be helpful, and I got some ideas that might help you. I think it's an important balance there, I guess, because in some ways I've rejected the more expert position of diagnosis and kind of reductionist labeling of human experience. I've kind of gone the opposite direction, where it's like, hey, I don't know anything, but that's not true either. It's like there's a middle ground there.
And what you're using the word idea in plural sense. I've got some ideas for you, and that's because we both know there are lots of different ways that you can help people.
Yeah.
And there are different people that help people in different ways, and those different people can get very good success doing their own way. So what we've got is a complex system, the human body, that's doing lots of different stuff, and it can be relatively difficult to understand at times, but certainly as you start to join patterns together as a more experienced clinician, no doubt the same for me and you, is that you can pattern recognize quicker, and you can know what works best for a certain pattern, right? So what comes across as a simple solution is based off of some complex understanding. However, the more simple we can make it, the better it is for someone to apply into their life. And I agree that sometimes it is, hey, I've got some things that we can try, because even though my pattern recognition and my experience will say this has got a high chance of success, it's still got a really still quite often you think, yeah, this is going to be the one, and it isn't, and it doesn't work for them.
Yeah.
And there's an example in my mind where a person came in similar to what we were explaining earlier about they'd seen another physio and things hadn't worked out quite so well, and actually it was a breathwork technique for him that helped him immediately regulate his pain, and it took a while for him to master it and apply it so he wasn't in pain as much as he would like to be. But in the session he was able to change his experience of pain when he was doing a particular movement. Super powerful and really great. But then another situation, the next week, try the same thing again. Oh, I've got this one. It's a breathwork technique. And they do the breathwork, pays the same. Okay. So we've got to then think around some other ideas. So
yeah,
there's lots of simple solutions, but you're never quite sure which one it's going to be.
Yeah.
And I think the higher chance of success are the ones where they are relatively simple to apply. People have complicated lives on top of their complicated bodies.
Yeah.
We need to try and simplify things in order for them to be confident that they can actually go and do it. Because like you've said, the issue around our jobs is that these one-to-one situations are only a snapshot of their lives. They have the 23 hours left in the day, plus the however often, the 6 days at least a week without you. So there's lots of time for them to need to apply these ideas into their lives.
Yeah, that resonates a lot. It makes me think about the importance of being irreverent to the approaches that might work for somebody else. In medieval Northern Europe, they used to have on New Year's Day this festival of fools. And in the Festival of Fools, it was an opportunity for the townsfolk to dress up like the more powerful people in society. And in doing so, they basically took the piss out of them for like the whole day. And it was all like jovial and jokey. And the more powerful people in society allowed that to happen because that was important for people to remain in the system, right? They had to have this kind of outlet of irreverence. They had to have this moment of like, oh, none of this matters. And in my practice, I often hold in mind that it's important for me to be irreverent. And there's been times where I've been in a process with somebody, and similar to you, where I'm like, oh, this is definitely going to be I'll say this thing and it'll be, the thing that changes it for them. And it's not. And then I will pivot quite quickly on that and be like, and I'll often say to people in therapy, I've got this idea, I'm going to share it with you. If it doesn't work, I've got other ideas, and I'm not wedded to this. I'll often actually be irreverent towards therapy and say, maybe therapy is the right thing, but if it's not, that's okay as well. Because I think our willingness to let go of the thing that maybe we've trained to do that feels important to us creates freedom and new opportunity in how people experience their treatment.
Trial and error is still a scientific approach, right? And we have to be willing to learn from that error rather than being wedded to one simple method. I think they're the problems, right? People who just have one method, they have a one-size-fits-all approach, and that's not a scientific approach. That's just being a guru without real credibility, in my opinion.
Yeah.
That story you told about the medieval Europe reminded me of modern day comedians. You mentioned comedians earlier. That is what they do. They essentially make fun out of the modern topical situations of the world, sometimes extremely serious stuff. They make fun out of it, and it helps us to see things in a different light and to understand things and to feel more comfortable to speak about it. So yeah, that's clearly something that's been played down through the generations and is a helpful way for society to come to terms with, and also for perhaps even the people at the top of society to stay in touch with the people.
Yeah, I think it's really important that we don't hold anything too tightly or become too kind of serious about or too rigid in our thinking. I guess, Jordan Peterson has been a controversial clinical psychologist for different reasons, and I found his synthesis of some ideas to be really helpful. Sometimes I've found his approach to have some rigidity to it, which for me feels antithetical to what, psychology, psychotherapy, academia should be about. It's about, as you said, the scientist practitioner model in some ways is about, it's a way of approaching a problem, not a defined way of
12 rules of life, right? That was his book, his main book, and that's basically saying it's like the commandments thing, 10 commandments, 12 rules of life. He's quite I know he's very religious in the way he sees the world, and I think that can sometimes happen in those situations, is that they see it through a very specific lens, their own lens. And I agree, I actually really like some of his ideas, but at times I find it too distancing. It's like, hang on, that isn't me, therefore does that then discredit everything? Because that particular rule doesn't make sense to me, because it's not quite the way I see it, and not the way I experience it. But I'll listen to him, and he's very compelling and really interesting and super intelligent with what he has to say as well. So we've got this idea then of society and the individual. I know that you feel very strongly about these ideas needing to be part of society and not just being passed down through the individual in these one-to-one sessions. You've got your own version of that as well. Tell our listeners a little bit about how you walk the walk with that kind of stuff.
In relation to understanding psychosis and things like that?
More to do with the group setting. How do you implement some of your ideas in group settings to help it play out in the community and not just in these one-to-one sessions?
Yeah, okay, yeah. So I've following the lead of Chris Powell, who set up I guess a movement or an approach called Cafe Psychologique in Leeds in 2011. And Cafe Psychologique was based on the back of the Cafe Scientifique movement, which was about bringing conversations about science to public spaces. And so at the moment in London, in southwest London, once a month, on the last Wednesday of the month, we have a group that meets together to talk about ideas related to psychology. And this isn't a space for psychologists, and it's not a space that has a lecturer. It's a space where we have a topic, and it kind of becomes an iterative process where group members might suggest topics that are of interest to them. Yeah, and I think that works really well. Like, in my mind, there is something about having a egalitarian or flat hierarchy. I mean, I guess I facilitate the space, but I definitely don't sit there as the person who has the answers. And I've learned a lot through establishing and facilitating those in Liverpool, where I grew up, in Sydney, and now in London. Yeah, I think one of the parts of that which has struck me most recently is that increasingly the people who are part of the group are saying, oh, this is kind of different because I'm sat in a circle talking to people without my phone and without distraction for 2 hours, and I'm learning about different people's perspectives. And I think over time we're kind of losing that.
And I imagine these sorts of ideas, I'd love for this to be part of how we educate our children. We continue to have these group discussions around concepts where the hierarchy is flattened at times, certainly in, any age really. I was going to say secondary school, but at any age, kids need to be empowered to have these ideas and have a safe space to talk and put forward. I mean, my kids say some crazy clever stuff sometimes. I'm like, how did you come to that idea? To me, that seems really advanced, and they're 4 and 7 years old. So I think we should be giving kids a space and some confidence to put those ideas forward. So hopefully these are the sorts of things that are part of education going forwards. But perhaps what happens is that we do lose it in our adult lives because of the way our society is so hierarchical, and because of the way we look to experts to give us all the answers. We lose that ability to contribute in a more flattened way.
One of the we have some guiding rules for the conversation, and one of them is speak from your experience rather than your knowledge. The temptation can be that when people come to these public spaces, they maybe feel a little bit uncertain, and they're more likely to go to a thing that they know than a thing they've experienced. But the conversation moves much better when people say, I had this time where I had this thing happen, whether that's in relation to feminism or, whether we can separate the art from the artist. I guess thinking about recent topics, whether romance is dead, hearing from people's lived experience rather than the thing that they read about how this and that is really useful. And there's something I think that's quite interesting about that, how conversations flow better when we connect more with the person's experience than the thing that they know. And yeah, a lot of the time I guess when I think about the podcast space or the information space, going back to the therapy culture idea, a lot of it is like, here's 5 things that I know, or that are gonna and knowledge that you can take. And yeah, I wonder what's lost in that, because in some ways we kind of need the nuance of each other's experience in order to get value from it, which I think is why AI won't kill therapy, because I think we need, we're not looking at AI priests as far as I'm aware, and I think we need people who have some human experience.
If experience clearly is such a key part of mental health, having good mental health, then with a lot of technology, it is around distraction and taking away the ability to feel in the moment. It's essentially numbing the feeling to some degree as well. So how does that play into your therapy sessions, the conversations around technology and distraction and taking away from experience? Do people struggle to feel, actually?
I think that there's definitely generational differences. Like, the youngest people that I work with are usually around 15. So the people who are in their mid to late teens are usually using their phone in a way that is, I don't know what the right word is. I guess I would say extreme, but it's not, because it's typical. But what's typical now is extreme in terms of the number of hours per day, and the necessity to be on Snap and maintain your streak and all that sort of stuff that comes with these pressures. So it's definitely a force to be reckoned with. And yeah, but I'm also quite, in my work with people, I'm quite realistic about that. I'm, in an ideal world, I guess we would, have time in the week without our phones, and most people are aware of the neurobiological impact of having these dopamine hits. But I also sometimes sit on my phone and scroll mindlessly. And one of the, I guess, commitments I made to myself as I started to work and train as a psychologist was that I would never ask someone to do something that I'm not willing to do myself, and that I'd always be honest in my limitations. So when I talk to people about the benefits of meditation, I might also say, I haven't done this for like 3 months, and I know that I would really benefit from it. Not so that the conversation is centered around me, but so that I'm connecting authentically with the thing that we're talking about, because I think that's important in the relationship with the person.
And it might be that by saying, I don't always do this as well, you're allowing them to fail with it too. It's just because it doesn't work for you, that doesn't mean that you're the problem. It could just be that this thing isn't quite right for you at this stage.
Yeah.
Let's try something else, like we said earlier. So let's try one of the other ideas that I might have.
Yeah.
If we've spoken then about applying these ideas into a society, we're obviously saying that society is important, community is important. I've spoken before on this podcast around this idea of the biopsychosocial approach, and that sometimes we get it the wrong way around, and perhaps it should be the socio-psychobio approach. What are the, and you mentioned the positives around how do you apply that into your society, both in your small circles but also into your big circles, how that can be a real positive influence. What are some of the negative connotations of how society can influence stress and cause distress?
Well, I think, we know much more about the political issues that contribute to distress than we know about the biological proponents of distress, which I don't know if that would be surprising to people, because we're often told that you need to take something to correct a chemical imbalance in your brain, or that, schizophrenia is an organic brain disease, but there is no evidence that that is the case. In fact, there's evidence that it's not. And so I think that there is a real unhelpful emphasis at times on this reductionist approach to understanding our experience. Like for me, these things are all on a continuum, and including things like psychosis or schizophrenia, they're part of typical human experience and can be understood usefully. That's not to say that I don't think medication is ever helpful or isn't useful to somebody, but in some ways I don't see it as condition specific, and the prescription of medication isn't condition specific. Often people are like, I had this thing, it was an antidepressant, but they gave me it because I can't sleep, or I'm anxious and they usually use it for this, but I'm taking it for that. And I see them as like the neurochemically active, and they alter our experience. But it's a little bit like drinking alcohol. We could all have a shot of vodka and have different experiences of that. And sometimes I think the what happens when we take a psychiatric medication is somewhat similar. Like some people will benefit, some to a different extent, some won't benefit. For me, that doesn't, someone not benefiting doesn't represent a treatment resistant version of a thing. It just means that isn't helpful for that person.
If you've looked back on someone's experience, certainly the early experiences, and you've recognized that the onset of some of their struggles and the barriers they're currently facing is related to their previous experiences, they can't unhave those experiences. So what kind of things might you help with someone if we know that they are determinants of mental health? What can you then do about it in the moment?
Yeah. Well, there are some alternatives to the medical model of distress. The Bible of that is the DSM, and then in Europe, mostly we use the ICD. And there are classification systems, so it's Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, is the DSM, and the International Classification of Disorders is the ICD. And they, I guess, are efforts to categorize human experience and then to lead to treatment protocols, but actually they fall short of what they are proposed to do, and the way that they're set up is quite arbitrary. It's basically by committee who kind of sit around and decide on what this looks like. So there have been alternatives put forward by the BPS. In 2018, I think it was published as the Power Threat Meaning Framework, which was an attempt to provide an alternative way of understanding human experience whilst taking into consideration the broader things that impact on people's mental health. So with that, in some ways, it's about acknowledging the powerful systems around us and the impact that they have on us, or the threat that we might experience in relation to that. In itself, to allow space for this being a thing, which in the acknowledgement of that thing, that factor, for example, let's say poverty, racism, or wherever it might be, in acknowledgement of that, we move away from this individualized idea that actually what you need to do is be more rational and have some CBT therapy and, connect more with your breath or whatever it might be and regulate through that experience. It provides it acknowledges the context, which, you're right, doesn't change it, especially if it's been historic. If it's present, I guess there are implications for what somebody might do in relation to that. I guess this is becoming a bit of an it depends answer, but in some ways, the acknowledgement of these external forces on a person's experience allows some opportunity for them to reconceptualize what's happened and to make changes in relation to that. But sometimes that isn't possible, right? If somebody is experiencing poverty and racism or whatever it might be, then and that's historic, then there aren't often things that can change. But I think if we at least are able to acknowledge that and say, this isn't a thing that is your responsibility to change. You didn't have the same opportunity as the person who grew up in a middle-class white household, then the acknowledgement in itself, I guess, provides some utility.
Do you think there's a kind of a positive otherment of that situation, that there are others that have gone through this as well? It's not just me. Do you think there can be like a connection there that helps someone as well?
Yeah, I think so. Finding groups and communities, and in relation to more severe and enduring types of mental health, to use that terminology, things like psychosis, there were groups set up around like the Hearing Voices Network as one of those, where it was kind of like allow people to connect to others who'd had this experience, who weren't seeing it as a biological illness, but as a manifestation of normal human experience, and sharing in that allowed for, I guess, some reduction in the intensity of those experiences for some people, or just a sense of community.
And given that you have very eloquently explained this continuum concept for psychosis, that it's all on this continuum, how do you think it actually happens where someone is shifted down that continuum towards a more psychotic experience of the world?
Yeah, I think usually, again, thinking about how we know more about the socio-environmental, political factors that contribute to distress, and I guess familial as well. I mean, these things become really tricky to talk about because there is a lot of it depends that happens in it, and there is an outdated concept in psychiatry of the schizophrenogenic mother, which was basically mothers were causing their children to develop schizophrenia later in life, which I guess if we understand that as psychosis, it kind of labels the family as responsible in quite a direct way, which feels like it's quite unfair. But we do know that when people experience poverty and experience racism, violence, trauma, that they're more likely to develop these experiences later on in life. And I think for me, I'm not quite sure of how the lived experiences of that manifest in the sense making, or the altered, experiences of cognition or whatever it might be, at like a kind of base level. But a lot of the times with it, with this idea of things being possible to understand in the context of what's happened to somebody, it is usually the case that you can look at the essence of the feeling that is connected to the voice hearing or the altered experience, and that is anchored in some sense that a person had at another point in their life, a point of being othered or feeling stressed, and then this idea felt appealing, and then they were isolated, so things kind of escalated in those ways. I think for me, I mentioned about sometimes I share with people about that time where I was going to sleep and I heard a voice shout my name, and it felt like an external voice. And lots of people do have experiences of voice hearing that don't become problematic. It's not a very unusual experience of mind, but in itself that can be quite frightening for people because of societal narratives about what is sane and insane, again with this like dichotomy idea. So I think that it depends, but if people are in a distressing situation for a long time without much support, they're isolated and they're coming up against it repeatedly, it's kind of in some ways an adaptive response that the mind starts to work in different
support
ways.
from itself.
Yeah, or echo the criticism. I worked a bit up in the north before I left for Australia with young people who were at risk of psychosis, and a lot of that would be people would come and say, I've been bullied, and the voice is a bullying voice, that's like, and of course, how could we possibly understand a 15-year-old's experience as a biological change when they've been bullied and the voice that they hear is the bully, and they're kind of scared of it and they're worried. There's a lot of those sorts of things where people had kind of like brief experiences of persecutory experiences. Unfortunately, it's not that common that the experiences are supportive. It's often the voices are critical if it's a voice.
I guess the supportive voices are the ones who cope, who don't need help, because actually that becomes a very positive aspect of their personality. If they don't have external support and they can echo positivity through their mind in that continuum concept, there's an element of psychosis within it because there is a voice that you are hearing, but it's on a continuum of normal and actually very beneficial. I've heard this idea of some people speak very often to themselves in their own minds and others don't. And I wonder whether that's even part of that perhaps the ones that don't, they've never needed to. They've had lots of people around them, and some that do and have a very positive spin on it. That's just a welcome companion to them because they didn't have that when they were growing up. I just think it's so fascinating how we don't have any certainties here, but we do have some really interesting ideas to explore to help us understand those experiences in different ways.
I think for me, I guess if people were listening to this and thinking about their own experience of mind, then I would say that if you're distressed and you have an unusual experience, that doesn't necessarily mean that there is some sort of problem. And in fact, it will be most helpful to think about what's been going on for you, what are the contributing stresses for you now and historically that might have led to this, in order to make sense of it, because that in itself can be diffusing. Thinking about the young people that I met with, and one in particular who was like, it's a voice of the bullies. A lot of the time with the young people up north who were at risk of psychosis, who'd had these experiences, what they needed to hear was, hey, you're not losing your mind. This is typical. Loads of people have this and you're going to be okay. And that reassurance in itself, because of the problematic narratives about how we should experience our mind, was powerful. But you're right. I mean, one of the things that I've been asking people more and more about is like, how do you experience your internal self? Some people don't have images in their mind. Some people don't have a voice internally. And there's all of those sorts of ways that people are different. And very rarely would we know that, or I guess we just make assumptions, right? That your mind is like mine and mine is like yours. And that when I look at this thing over here, you see the same sort of thing. Or when that person says X, Y, or Z, you think that was supportive or, a hurtful comment or whatever it might be. But actually, I guess it links back to that idea of how to be helpful to people in therapy. I think the slowing down in the understanding and exploration of those things allows for the nuance to emerge and to think with people about why they've come to understand themselves in that way and what their experience of self is. To understand and accept, or understand and facilitate change.
Yes, we've come a full circle quite nicely. We've ambulated around the problem and ended up closer to the true roots of the podcast episode. What have we not spoken about that you think would be interesting for us to explore in the closing stages of the episode?
I mean, probably lots of different things, right? I guess it's always, because if we take this assumption that it depends, then it means that we could probably have this conversation in 5 different ways and have, there'd be nuance in that each time. I think increasingly I've been working with people in a sports and performance context, and I feel quite lucky to have trained as a clinical psychologist before I started riding my bike so much and racing. And I think, what I've been struck by is that actually it's kind of all the same. I get, in some ways, what I've searched for in my work is some sort of unifying philosophy, something that is true when somebody experiences psychosis and true when somebody is an elite sports person, those kind of commonalities of humanness. And fundamentally, I think it boils down to like the person and their experience should come first, and allowing space to understand that, even if, society might say, actually, this person is really problematic to us. We've got to start there. We've got to start with some exploration, because through the exploration, you get some change. So I guess we didn't speak much about the performance side of things, but I think we covered most of what feels important in relation to mental health. This idea of it's not what's wrong with you, it's what's happened to you, that distress is on a continuum, that all manifestations of distress in some ways are a reflection of an underlying challenge that someone's having currently or in the past. I think those things feel big, and in some ways our task, maybe your task as well, I guess it sounds like from us talking together, is to support people to become more like themselves and not try and echo other people. I guess this really does take us full circle with the idea of therapy culture, because there's a lot of social comparison that naturally happens through Instagram, TikTok, or wherever it might be. And I remember a supervisor once said to me, your task is to be you as a therapist. You don't, like, Carl Rogers was great at doing what he did because he was Carl Rogers, and Freud was great because he was Freud, but you've got to do your version of this thing. And whenever I meet with somebody, I often think about that the circumambulatory process is one of allowing them to become like themselves. And I guess we start at different points depending on how stressful their life has been and what factors might be limiting that. But as much as possible, we help to move people towards that.
And this is why I love this question, because I always want to hear what your version of Better Never Ends is. I prepped you, I warned you this question was coming.
Yeah.
What does it mean in your world, in your mind, in your experience?
Yeah. I think from in some ways, I'm wondering as I'm talking if some of the ideas that I've spoken about lie in contradiction to each other. This idea of like, we individualize therapy and this is how it's helpful, and people should become more like themselves. And also, like, sometimes people have been and are going through so much stuff that we couldn't comprehend that actually that's not going to be possible. So it's hard not to answer this whilst holding that in mind. So that, I guess that's why it depends. In some ways, with an individualized perspective in mind, somebody once told me that, we're a work in progress and then we die. It's a kind of bleak perspective, but in some ways it rings true. There's something about continuing to learn, continuing to understand things differently, continuing to try and like be present, find peace, support people, be useful in society. That kind of feels important in terms of like a broader betterment. I think for me in my work, it's about continuing to learn and take that position of I don't know what this is going to be like, even if I think I've met with this similar thing before, as you mentioned. Supporting people to do more of what they can do or they might want to do, and also being mindful of the broader context, which I guess as I talk now, I wonder if some of the contradiction has come up for me, because when I was during my psychology training, I was much more interested in like the socio-political environment. Like Brexit happened, we thought Corbyn was going to get elected. And for people who were more left-leaning socialist, it felt like we might be able to shift some of these things that are happening societally. And I'm aware that as I moved to Australia and lived in Sydney, which was a much more kind of individualistic culture, and since I've come back, that maybe some of my, maybe I've kind of cut off from some of that. And I don't know what to do with it, because I work privately. I don't work in the NHS anymore. I'm kind of complicit in a system, and also I kind of need to make a living, and I want to, help people who want support. So I mean, there's a lot of contradiction that remains, and I suppose this idea of betterment kind of brings that forward, because I'm like, well, what do we do about the broader societal challenges that people are experiencing, and how do can I be useful in that? In Australia, I did a lot of work trying to implement a model that I thought, called Open Dialogue, that I thought could change mental health services. And I thought that we did some good work, but ultimately it didn't make much of a dent overall. And maybe I just became disenchanted through that. So, I'm trying to remain optimistic, not be too nihilistic, and kind of keep going.
I believe these podcasts are my version of being able to achieve that goal, that broader goal, is to share these conversations for free to the wider world, and to have conversations with people where we can help, perhaps on an individual level, but with a much bigger reach than I can ever do in one-to-one sessions. Even if I'm back-to-back, day in, day out, it's still limited to that one-to-one session. This has the potential to reach far and wide. Yeah. So I'm very aligned with you, because I have some ideas as well around helping as many people as I can, because I know that the socioeconomic powers are against me, and I can't always have the impact I would like to have, and there's many people who can't afford our services on a one-to-one basis. So I'm with you on that, and you've now contributed to that effort, so hopefully that gives you a little bit of peace of mind. And we're finishing on a nihilistic note, aren't we? That we are a work in progress, and then we die. That is, if Nietzsche was to rewrite our slogan of "Better Never Ends," that's what we would call it, wouldn't he? So on that note, I guess we are coming to an end. How would people come to find you if they want to work with you, reach out, ask some questions?
Yeah, I mean, I guess this is I mean, they can Google me. I've got a website, and I'm kind of on Instagram. Yeah, and I'm thinking about how where I want to be, online, and what that's going to look like. But my Instagram handle is runstm, partly because I used to be a runner, and partly because I like hip hop. So it's runstm. I'll probably put more stuff through that over the coming months, and then through the usual channels of LinkedIn. I'm searchable. And the Cafe Psychology, if people were interested in that, is in Putney on the last Wednesday of every month. So I mean, maybe actually that's one of the ways that initially I was like, I'll charge for that space because I'm facilitating it, but that's a free event, and I'm keen to do more of that to bring people into these kind of shared conversations. So anyone who wants to come on to that is welcome to.
I'll come and join.
Yeah, great.
We'll put some stuff on our socials.
That'd be awesome.
But thanks very much for your time today, Charlie. Steve. It's been great.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to today's podcast. This podcast is sponsored by Better, provider of health and wellness services in central London. We really believe that we can help people feel better and live better. You can book in for face-to-face services at any of our 3 London clinics. We have one in Marylebone, one in Soho, and one in the city. You can also follow us on Instagram at Better Never Ends, or head over to our website for more information about the clinics or the podcast at www.betterneverends.com.